a business class ticket, a punctual passenger, and a valid seat. But simply because he didn't look like the people who usually sat there, he was asked to leave the plane. On an ordinary morning at Hallbridge International Airport, everything unfolded as usual. The intercom echoed across terminals. Passengers lined up for boarding, and ground staff smiled with the practiced courtesy typical of international travel. On board Flight AS-98 from New York to San Francisco, a business class route operated by the renowned airline Airstar Premier, no one anticipated that a seemingly minor incident would ignite one of the most immense media firestorms the airline industry had seen in over a decade. Ethan Brown, a successful entrepreneur and the founder and CEO of the tech firm ClearPath AI, had just completed the boarding process with his signature calm demeanor. At 42, he wore a dark blue suit, simple yet refined, with a chestnut leather briefcase resting neatly over his shoulder. There were no flashy designer items, no gold watches, no oversized sunglasses, only the quiet confidence of a seasoned professional. Seat 1A, the most coveted spot in the business cabin, was the one he had pre-selected, partly for its generous legroom, ideal for working throughout the 6-hour flight, and partly for the quiet isolation it offered at the front of the plane. Ethan was a Titan Privé member, the highest tier in Airstar's loyalty program, earned through hundreds of business flights and millions of miles accumulated over more than 15 years. As Ethan opened his tablet to review materials for his keynote speech at the Global Ethics and Technology Conference scheduled for the next day, a soft but oddly toned voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir. There seems to be a mix-up with the seating. We want to ask if you could move to accommodate our VIP passenger." The speaker was Claire Madison, the lead flight attendant with over 9 years of experience in elite flights. Regular passengers widely praised Claire for her poise, meticulous attention to detail, and uncanny ability to remember names. But this time, although her voice retained its usual softness, there was an underlying stiffness, something hesitant, awkward, and distant. Standing just behind Claire was a white woman in her early 40s, Monica Wessler, visibly impatient. She wore a tailored Max Mara suit, carried a Chanel handbag, and frowned in Ethan's direction, as if something about him didn't quite belong in the picture. Monica glanced at her watch and murmured just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I always sit in 1A on this route. It's practically my seat." Ethan looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He didn't recognize anyone involved in the exchange and had never encountered a situation like this before. "I'm sorry, but this is the seat printed on my ticket," Ethan replied calmly. "I'm also a Titan tier member with the airline." He pulled out his wallet and presented his loyalty card and boarding pass. Claire glanced at them and offered a faint smile, quickly fading into uncertainty. "I understand that, Mr. Brown," Claire responded, "but this seat is usually reserved for our regulars people. We know fly this route often." Ethan nodded slowly, though unease had already begun creeping into his thoughts. He looked around, noticing that a few nearby passengers had stopped what they were doing to observe. Their expression shifted from idle curiosity to growing confusion. Some began discreetly pulling out their phones, pretending to check messages, but angling their cameras. Monica, now blocking the aisle, began dramatizing her frustration. "I have a meeting right after we land. I can't sit anywhere else but my usual spot. This airline knows that." Her sigh echoed through the cabin. A few passengers exchanged irritated glances, unsure who to blame, But one thing was clear. The situation was no longer ordinary. Ethan remained seated, but he now felt the weight of invisible scrutiny, as though he didn't belong in a space he had every right to occupy, despite being a top-tier customer with a valid reservation, punctual arrival, and perfectly courteous behavior. He could not have predicted that the seat he had occupied hundreds of times before would become the spark for a series of events that would soon shake the very foundation of the airline industry. The business class cabin was typically quiet, refined, and almost entirely insulated from the rest of the aircraft. There was no jostling or noise here. Everything operated within a silence worth thousands of dollars per flight. And it was within that silence that the voice of Trevor Linwood, the flight supervisor, sliced through like a sharp needle, shattering the cultivated calm. "Mr. Brown, we need your cooperation to move seats for a returning customer with a higher priority." Ethan didn't react immediately. He looked up, blinking once, as if to confirm he'd heard correctly. His fingers remained on the tablet keyboard, and the presentation was still on the screen. "I'm sorry." Ethan asked, his tone not hostile, but each word deliberate and unmistakably clear. Trevor didn't walk back his statement. Instead, he took a step closer and leaned in, attempting to seem friendly, though his eyes offered no warmth. "This seat is usually held for passengers with a longer relationship with the airline. The guest waiting over there, Mrs. Wessler, is one of our most valued regulars." Ethan blinked again. In his mind, the formal language clashed against memories of being stared at in hotel lobbies, having his luggage searched more thoroughly than others, or being asked to verify his ID 3 times at check-in, despite holding a confirmed reservation. He silently closed his tablet and set it aside. There were no loud motions, but the quiet act drew the attention of a few nearby passengers. "I understand," Ethan replied, "but I'm not taking anyone's seat. My ticket clearly states 1A. I'm also a Titan member, as I've already shown." Claire, the lead flight attendant, remained beside them, her expression uneasy, yet she said nothing. She stood, caught between two forces: a rule-abiding customer, a frequent flyer, known for generous tips, and a habit of complaining when not pampered. From behind, Monica sighed loudly and deliberately. "Every flight, it's the same nonsense. What a waste of time." A man seated in 2C let out a quiet, derisive chuckle. A woman to Ethan's right silently slid her phone onto her lap camera, already recording. Trevor kept his faint smile, but his voice had lost any trace of politeness. "Mr. Brown, there are 2 options here. You can cooperate peacefully, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. The "or" was clear enough. A taut silence spread through the cabin. Distant crew members began to take notice. Eyes turned toward the scene. Phones began shifting from idle to recording. Every word landed like a stone cast into still water in this stillness. Ethan took a breath. Not deep, not dramatic, just enough to remind himself, don't let others write your story by provoking you into a reaction. He responded with measured calm. "I won't give up my heat." Trevor blinked. Claire subtly stepped aside as if bracing for something to escalate. Monica crossed her arms and let out a small, contemptuous laugh, as though the ordeal were some bothersome farce she was being forced to witness. Trevor gave a slight nod, his expression stripped of its previous composure. He turned, strode to the front of the cabin, and picked up the crew intercom. No one could hear what he said, but his gestures, tense voice, and irritated face made it clear he was calling someone higher up. 5 minutes later, the cockpit door opened. Out stepped Captain Adrian Knox, tall and silver at the temples, his face seasoned and his gaze cold as frost. Following him were Trevor and Claire. The three walked up to seat way, now resembling a small stage with Ethan Brown as its reluctant lead. "Mr. Brown, I'm the captain of this flight," Adrian began, voice firm, but attempting neutrality. "I've been informed there's a seating issue." "There is no issue," Ethan replied. "I'm sitting in the seat I booked and paid for." The captain didn't argue. He looked at Ethan, then at Monica, still standing in the aisle, her face wearing an exaggerated scowl. "In certain cases, to ensure convenience and a consistent passenger experience, we are authorized to make seating adjustments." Ethan looked up, his gaze unwavering. "And I ask again, what makes someone else more deserving of this seat than I am?" Trevor jumped in, unable to hold back. "You're making this difficult for the entire crew. If you refuse cooperation, we may remove you from this flight." Ethan was silent for several seconds, a silence heavy as thunderclouds. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and began recording. "I am currently being threatened with removal from this flight, despite sitting in my assigned seat, holding a valid ticket, and maintaining the highest loyalty status." Trevor stepped back, visibly unsettled. He reached out instinctively to block the camera. "You're not allowed to record." Ethan pulled the phone back toward himself. "There is no federal regulation prohibiting recording unless I'm interfering with crew operations, and clearly I'm sitting still in my seat." A few sighs echoed from the rear of the cabin. A man murmured, "What the hell is this? He didn't do anything wrong." A woman added, "That's blatant discrimination." And amid the unfolding exchange, the man seated silently in 1A remained the only one not yelling, not performing, and yet commanding everyone's attention. Not because he raised his voice, but because he refused to back down. The sound of footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin like the ticking of fate. Emerging between the rows of scattered seats and curious stares, two uniformed airport security officers came into full view under the overhead lighting. The business class cabin fell nearly silent. Some passengers instinctively leaned forward to get a better look, while others lowered their heads, avoiding the uncomfortable shame of witnessing something no one dared to name. The officers stopped in front of Ethan. One was relatively young, visibly uneasy in the face of the camera still recording. The older and more seasoned, the other tried to mask his tension, but his eyes betrayed it. The younger officer spoke first, his voice straining for calm. "Sir, we've been informed of an incident in the cabin and asked to escort you off the aircraft." Ethan didn't move. His phone continued recording, resting lightly on his leg. His voice, however, was surprisingly steady. "I'd like to ask clearly what airline policy I have violated, or which airport regulation." The two officers glanced at each other. Apparently, they hadn't been adequately briefed, merely called in to assist the crew. Another passenger, who had recorded everything, murmured, "They have no reason. There's been no disturbance here." Ethan looked directly at the older officer. His gaze wasn't defiant, but weary, the look of someone who had seen this before and knew it would happen again. "I have a boarding pass, a loyalty card, and a seat printed on my ticket," Ethan said. "I haven't raised my voice, pushed anyone, or caused a disturbance. I'm simply defending my right to sit in the seat I paid for." The older officer looked down at the tablet and gave the faintest nod, as if confirming what Ethan had just said. In his expression, something shifted from protocol to conscience. "I understand, sir," he said. "But we still need you to step off the flight so we can address this matter outside." No outburst. No slamming of fists. Ethan powered down his tablet, put away his phone, and stood. He didn't look at Monica, who now wore a smug smile as if she'd won. Nor did he glance at Trevor standing in the background like someone who had sprung a trap. Ethan looked straight ahead, walking in silence, like someone all too familiar with being excluded without explanation and no longer afraid of it. He exited the cabin with a straight back and unwavering gaze. He didn't need to prove anything, but everyone who witnessed it knew he hadn't lost. They were the ones who had just lost something far greater. A young man in the last row whispered to his friend, "The way he walks. It's like he's the one in charge." And he wasn't wrong. As Ethan stepped off the aircraft and into the airport's security reception area, his phone lit up instantly. He opened his messaging app and typed rapidly, "Lisa, cancel all my appointments for the next 2 hours. Assemble the legal team immediately. Get PR on standby. We need to respond now." On the other hand, Lisa Hammond, Chief Operating Officer of ClearPath AI, read the message she had never imagined receiving a year ago. But today she wasn't surprised. She knew Ethan. She knew that when he chose to act, it wasn't for revenge, but to correct something broken at its core. Meanwhile, the two security officers stood nearby, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Their job was technically done, but the strongest emotion they now carried wasn't duty fulfilled. It was an unspoken shame. The older one finally broke the silence. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said quietly. "The report claims you were being disruptive, but what we've seen tells a very different story." Ethan nodded without replying. He opened his voice memo app and began recording a complete account of the incident, time, words, gestures, and glances. He remembered it all, and his voice did not tremble. Not long after, a young woman hurried toward him near the departure gate, clutching a phone in one hand and a small carry-on in the other. Her face was flushed with anger, but her voice carried quiet respect. "Excuse me, Mr. Brown, I was sitting right across the aisle. I got off the plane after seeing what happened to you. I couldn't just sit there and watch." She held up her phone and played the video for him. Everything had been captured. The snide remarks, Ethan's calm and justified refusal, and the moment Monica discreetly handed Trevor money after he was forced to leave. Ethan watched, and his expression softened for the first time that morning. "Thank you. This is incredibly valuable," he said. "This might change everything." They exchanged contact information. The young woman, Joanne, said she would testify whenever needed. She didn't know that her video would soon go viral at an astonishing pace, catapulting the incident to the front pages of national news outlets. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Monica Wessler had settled comfortably into seat 1A. Lifting her hand to accept a glass of champagne, like someone reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Claire bowed slightly, offering a strained smile. "We're sorry for the inconvenience, Mrs. Wessler. We'll ensure the rest of your flight is perfect." In the dim galley, Trevor and Claire exchanged a knowing glance. Trevor discreetly retrieved a folded $200 bill from his jacket pocket, and a thank you was handed to him before Ethan left his seat. "Not every day you get an easy bonus like this," Trevor muttered. Claire said nothing. But if one looked closely, they might have seen a flicker of unease in her eyes, a brief moment of reckoning deep down that things had gone too far, and that instinct proved correct. Just 40 minutes after takeoff, the in-flight intercom rang repeatedly. A message from headquarters. Urgent call from the airline CEO. There's a serious issue involving the passenger removed from this flight. None of the crew knew yet that the man they had deemed unfit to sit in seat 1A was the very person who held 25% ownership of the airline they were serving. And this was only the beginning. On the top floor of Airstar Airlines' sleek glass headquarters, the midday sun poured through the tall windows, casting sharp lines across the boardroom. The space looked more like a penthouse apartment than the nerve center of a global airline, but no one in the room had the luxury of appreciating the view. Airstar's chief executive officer, Richard Whitmore, sat fixated on his computer screen. A man usually brimming with pride, while signing multi-million-dollar contracts, now looked as if the blood had drained from his face. Across the long table, the communications director, a middle-aged woman with short hair and thick glasses, was trying hard to keep her voice steady. "Sir, the video from Flight AS-98 has passed 2 million views in just 4 hours, and it's still rising. Fast, very fast." Richard folded his arms and closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself not to react on impulse. Then he opened them again and spoke in his usual executive tone. "The passenger removed from the flight. We've dealt with these kinds of incidents hundreds of times. Issue a statement. Call it a misunderstanding between the crew and the customer. Promise to review procedures." The communications director swallowed hard. Her eyes reflected a deeper worry, unlike the usual PR firestorms they'd weathered. This was different. "Mr. Whitmore, we don't grasp how serious this is. The video doesn't just show the passenger being removed despite not being disruptive. It also—" She hesitated, then tapped a button to project the video onto the screen in the center of the room. The boardroom fell silent. The footage from the business class cabin played in high definition. Ethan Brown, calm and composed, was being asked to leave his seat, his voice steady, his words crystal clear. "I am being forced to leave my assigned seat simply because another passenger wants it." Then came the scene where Monica discreetly slipped money into Trevor's hand, her voice dripping with entitlement. "Thank you for handling this. First class should have standards." The screen went black. No one spoke. No one exhaled. No one moved. Richard pushed back from his chair and exhaled deeply, then asked in disbelief, "Who is the passenger? Do we have a name?" A young assistant near the door holding an iPad replied with a shaky voice, "Yes, sir. According to the manifest. His name is Ethan Marcus Brown." Richard's hand froze midair. He turned his head slowly, his expression darkening. "It can't be that name." One of the board members whispered, "You know him. Know him." Richard let out a dry, bitter laugh. "He's the founder of ClearPath AI, the potential partner we've been courting for a $50 million system upgrade contract over the past 2 years. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly to full crisis mode. And still, that wasn't the final blow. Flipping through shareholder records, the chief financial officer suddenly stopped at a page. His face went pale. "Oh my God, it's not just the contract. His company, through an affiliated investment fund, owns nearly 25% of Airstar's stock." For a second, the entire room seemed to lose gravity. Executives, division heads, vice presidents, and all the people used to making million-dollar decisions fell into stunned silence. Because they hadn't just removed the wrong passenger. They had insulted the one man who could determine the fate of their entire airline. At that very moment, in a quiet airport lounge, Ethan sat surrounded by his most trusted inner circle: Lisa, Chief Operating Officer; Max, Legal Counsel; Rachel, Head of Communications, all present. Laptops open, phones buzzing. Inboxes are already flooded with inquiries from major news outlets. Rachel looked at Ethan, her voice soft. "Do you want to make a statement now? People are waiting to hear from you." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He turned to look out the window where the late afternoon light reflected off the polished marble floor. His face held no anger, no urgency, just sharp clarity. "Not yet," he said. "We don't need to speak. They'll figure it out themselves." Lisa nodded. She knew Ethan, and when he chose silence, it wasn't retreat. It meant he was preparing something bigger than words. Night fell faster than usual on the 40th floor of Airstar's headquarters. Though darkness had settled outside, the building remained brightly lit, as if midday still reigned. In the largest shareholder meeting room, reserved only for non-negotiable emergencies, no one glanced at their phone. Every eye was fixed on the closed oak door. No one said it out loud, but they all knew the man they once underestimated was now the only one who could save the company from collapse. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his face noticeably more gaunt than that morning. In his hands was a printed financial alert from the accounting department. Airstar stock has dropped 14.7% in the past 6 hours. Further decline expected if immediate action is not taken. Beside him, executive board members, people once radiant with pride when signing global sponsorship deals, now avoided each other's gaze, like school children awaiting punishment. Suddenly, the door opened. Everyone turned, almost in unison. Ethan Brown entered. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't stride in, nor did he hesitate. He offered no greeting. But the silence that accompanied him spoke louder than any opening remark. Close behind were Lisa Hammond, CEO of ClearPath AI, Max Eldridge, Legal Counsel, and 2 others, a shareholder, representative, and a financial advisor. Ethan took the seat directly opposite Richard. Their eyes met, and the entire room understood at that moment the relationship between potential partner and vendor had reversed entirely. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a trial. Richard summoned all the resolve he had to break the silence. "Mr. Brown, we would like to extend our sincerest apologies for the unacceptable incident this morning. I assure you, the actions taken do not reflect the values of Airstar." Ethan kept his expression neutral. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He looked and waited. "We are committed to taking internal action, possibly suspending those involved, improving crew training, and—" "No," Ethan interrupted. His voice wasn't raised, but it silenced the entire room. "I didn't come here to hear promises. I came here because I have authority." Richard hesitated slightly. Ethan leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, not as a threat, but as a statement of clarity. ClearPath AI currently holds 24.8% of Airstar shares. Combined with our affiliated strategic partners, that total surpasses the threshold of influential control. I have the right to call an emergency shareholder meeting, and I am doing that right now. Across the table, several shareholders began exchanging looks. One of them, a representative from Northbridge Capital, who owned another 9% and had previously supported management, nodded slowly. "Not anymore." Ethan opened the folder in front of him. I have two demands. One, all staff involved in today's incident, including flight attendant Claire Madison, supervisor Trevor Linwood, and Captain Adrian Knox, are to be immediately and unconditionally terminated. Two, the $50 million tech partnership contract that Airstar has been pursuing with ClearPath will be permanently canceled. Richard remained frozen. The board members, who had hoped to sit on the sidelines and treat this as a pre-crisis, now had to confront an unavoidable reality. Airstar was facing a reckoning. One executive attempted to interject, but perhaps we could consider temporary suspension. They are long-time employees, highly experienced, and I'm not negotiating, Ethan replied, unblinking. This is a test of your moral compass. You can choose accountability. Or I, along with our affiliated shareholders, will divest entirely. And I promise you, no one will step in to replace me after this morning's video. A deadly silence followed, not out of rage, but because everyone knew he was right. Just then, the door burst open again. A young financial analyst nearly ran inside, forgetting to ask permission. I'm sorry, but Airstar's stock has dropped another 6% in the last 30 minutes. Major outlets such as CNN, Forbes, and Reuters are all running headlines. If there's no decisive action today, the market could plunge another 20 to 25%. It was a death knell, not by investors, but by the market itself. Richard placed his pen on the table. He had no choice left. We accept all your demands. Ethan nodded. No smile. No victory. Only the quiet determination of a man who had just cleared poisoned soil to begin planting anew. That afternoon, a soft ding sounded through the intercom on the 12th floor, the Human Resources Division of Airstar. Like a reflex from trained habit, the three senior staff members waiting outside, Trevor Linwood, Claire Madison, and Captain Adrian Knox, stood up simultaneously when they were called into Conference Room 4. This meeting room had no glass walls, natural light, or even decorative art like the high-level executive rooms. It was just a closed, silent space with a round table, 4 chairs, and 2 plainclothes security personnel standing silently at either door. No one spoke. But the air spoke volumes. The director of human resources entered, accompanied by the company's legal counsel. No preamble, no small talk. She opened a folder, flipped to 3 identical files, and gently slid them across the table. Based on internal evidence, passenger-provided video, and the executive leadership's findings, your employment with Airstar is hereby terminated, effective immediately and without condition. Claire's mouth fell open. Trevor jolted out of his chair, ready to protest, but the piercing look from the company lawyer froze him in place. Captain Knox said nothing. He merely rubbed his forehead and lowered his head in silence. Is this punishment? Trevor hissed, voice tight. I was following procedure. He was disruptive. He interfered with the crew. No, the HR director cut in. You violated professional ethics, abused your authority, and accepted money from a passenger, a behavior strictly forbidden under all circumstances. It was a blow, not just to the conscience, but to the careers of all 3 once high-ranking in the company hierarchy, now brought crashing down in hours. Claire, who had remained silent until now, suddenly broke down. No sobs, but tears streamed quietly down her cheeks. She wasn't a bad person, but she had remained silent at a moment when silence was the worst thing she could have offered. Captain Knox finally spoke slowly, his voice sounding a decade older. I trusted my crew's judgment. I didn't witness the incident from the start. Maybe I should have asked more questions, or at least not assumed who was in the right. Yes, the legal counsel replied, and that assumption is exactly why you're being removed from the cockpit after 30 years of service. Trevor threw a glance of blame at Claire, then stared down at his trembling hands. All those years of being praised for handling difficult situations were shattered by something he hadn't even believed was a big deal. It wasn't just me, he tried to say, but his words vanished into the room's cold air. All three were asked to sign an acknowledgement of their termination. No one responded, but everyone knew there was nothing left to bargain. They were escorted out past the workstations of other employees, eyes averted. A few bowed their heads slightly. It felt like walking through judgment, with no handcuffs, but no dignity. One junior employee exhaled after they left and muttered, "I used to respect Trevor, but now I feel relieved." Upstairs, as word of the dismissal spread across Airstar, a whole company meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Over 800 employees, from flight crew engineering, customer service logistics, and more, were called to attend either in person at headquarters or via the global internal meeting platform. Richard Whitmore took the stage in the main auditorium, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Ethan Brown. The presence of Ethan brought a hush over the entire room. People had seen his face in Forbes and heard his name in high-level conferences, but never had he felt so close, so real, as he did now, standing before them, no longer just a symbol, but a man. Richard began with a simple, unembellished statement. Yesterday, Airstar failed. Not because we lost a contract, not because our stock dropped, but because we failed most fundamentally. We failed to respect human dignity. He paused, scanning the room, then handed the microphone to Ethan. Ethan stepped forward. No notes. He didn't need them. As a kid, I dreamed of sitting in business class, not for the champagne, not for the big seat, but because I thought it was a place where everyone was treated equally. But when you're asked to leave your assigned seat simply because someone else thinks you don't fit the image they're used to, Coolers said that seat is no longer just a place to sit. It becomes a mirror reflecting injustice. The auditorium was silent. I'm not standing here for revenge. I'm standing here to begin something new. He turned briefly toward Richard, then looked at the entire leadership team. Starting tomorrow, all Airstar operations will pause for 48 hours. Why? So that every employee, from baristas to executives, will participate in a training program on unconscious bias and service ethics developed by ClearPath AI. There were murmurs. 2 days of company-wide shutdown, unheard of. But Ethan raised his hand so as not to quiet the room, but to invite them to listen. Yesterday was a crisis, but tomorrow can be a beginning. The next morning, when Airstar Airlines announced a 48-hour suspension of all flights to implement its Bias and Ethics in Service training program, news outlets immediately dubbed it the most sweeping reform in U.S. commercial aviation history. Some in the industry called it reckless. Certain analysts scoffed. This must be the most expensive PR stunt of the decade. But those on the inside, the flight attendants, the technicians, the check-in agents, those who had witnessed the system operate on unspoken rules and invisible biases for years, breathed a quiet sigh of relief. At last, someone had dared to stop. In a small conference room, hastily converted into a training center, at Airstar's Atlanta branch, Trevor Linwood, once a flight supervisor, now dismissed, sat silently in the third row. He wore plain clothes, no name badge, no authority. Next to him, a notebook sat open. On the first page, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were the words, "No longer a victim, no longer on the sidelines." The training session began. The instructor, Ethan Brown, entered to surprise many in the room. Trevor instinctively lowered his gaze, but Ethan didn't look at him. He looked at the entire room, as if every person there deserved to be present. "I'm not standing here as a shareholder or a CEO," Ethan began. "I'm here as someone who was once judged at first glance, and now I'm here to begin something different." A woman in the front row slowly raised her hand, voice trembling. "I used to think bias was something other people had, not me. But now, I realize my silence was part of the problem too." Ethan nodded. "We don't need to be perfect. We must start seeing what we've never noticed, and then choose to do what's right." The room fell into deep quiet. Trevor picked up his pen and wrote a second line. "I thought I was good just because I never hated anyone. But maybe I never stood for what was right when it mattered." At another training center in Chicago, Claire Madison, former lead flight attendant, was seated with a new group of trainees, analyzing a simulation video showing a scenario of unfair treatment between two passengers. When one participant commented, "I've seen something like this before, but I didn't speak up because I was afraid of getting disciplined," Claire spoke up unexpectedly. "I was like that once. I know exactly how that feels. But I wish I had been braver, even just once." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. Today's lesson wasn't about procedure. It was about human worth. And she now understood how her silence that day, though small, had caused far greater harm than she realized. Meanwhile, back at ClearPath, AI headquarters, Ethan was reviewing an independent audit report on customer experience data 1 month after the program's rollout. Satisfaction scores among Black, Middle Eastern, and Latinx passengers increased by 37%. Over 92% of Airstar staff had completed at least one unconscious bias training module. Discrimination-related complaints dropped to near zero within 30 days. Lisa, Ethan's COO, put the report down and remarked, "If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd have thought the numbers were just PR fluff." Ethan gave a quiet smile, but in his eyes was the calm of someone who had lived months wound tight as a wire. People don't change overnight, but if you give them a mirror and a window, they might begin to see themselves and to see others. At a post-reform press event, a middle-aged passenger, a woman who had flown Airstar regularly for over 12 years, was invited to share her recent experience. "I don't know what exactly changed inside the company, but I can feel it. The flight attendants no longer ask for my name. They hear it. They don't just serve, they connect. And if someone like Ethan boarded a flight today, no one would ask, 'Are you sure you're in the right seat?' anymore." In a quiet corner of this sprawling story, Captain Adrian Knox, the former pilot dismissed quietly, was now teaching a new seminar titled "Command Responsibility in Ethical Emergencies." On the screen behind him was a still image from the video that changed everything. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide it. "I failed to act when it mattered," he told the room, "and that was the most expensive lesson of my career. But if I can help someone avoid making my mistake, Then my failure wasn't wasted. 3 months after the incident, Airstar became the first airline in the U.S. to receive the distinction. Exceeds expectations in fairness of service from 3 independent civil rights organizations. Not because of an ad campaign, but because one man pushed out of a seat he legally held had chosen to stand up, not for revenge, but for change. Ethan continued investing in the airline, but under one condition. Airstar would submit independent, transparent reports on its cultural reform and internal equity practices each quarter. Not control, but a commitment to a new standard. One late afternoon, in a quiet ClearPath office, Lisa asked, "Ethan, do you think you've paid the price for what happened?" Ethan shook his head. "I never thought of this as a price to pay." He turned toward the window where the golden light of dusk bathed his desk. His voice softened. "Sometimes, change doesn't begin with who's right or wrong. It starts with who's willing not to back down. And if someone has to go first, I'll be that person." On an ordinary day, 3 months after the storm, Ethan Brown sat quietly at a small cafe near his office. No bodyguards. No one recognized him, and that made him smile. He didn't need to be recognized, only for what he believed in to be remembered. His phone vibrated softly. A message came in from a number not saved in his contacts. "Hi, this is Trevor. Not sure if you'd want this message. However, I just completed the final internship module in the Second Chance program, and I wanted to say thank you. I never thought I needed to relearn how to see people, but now I'm not afraid of change anymore." Ethan stared at the message. He reread it, and again. Not because he was surprised, but because something inside him quietly loosened, like a knot that had finally come undone, no explanation needed. He didn't respond right away, but he knew that kindness doesn't need applause, only consistency. At an international forum on cultural reinvention after corporate crisis, Ethan was invited to speak at the final session. One delegate raised a hand and asked, "What made you not retaliate?" "Not sure. Not take down the entire airline. Something we know you had the power to do." Ethan didn't answer right away. He stepped down from the stage, walked closer to the audience, and spoke softly. "I had the power to retaliate. I had a valid reason, public support, and every financial advantage, but I realized in a world where everyone wants to be right, the hardest thing is choosing not to destroy, but to repair." He paused, then continued, "I didn't do it because I'm noble. I did it because I was once an 11-year-old kid pulled out of a grocery store by a security guard just for wearing a hoodie. If someone, just one person, had stood up for me, then things might have been different. I didn't do this for me. I did it for the next person, so they won't have to beg to be seen as worthy." The real lesson in this story doesn't lie in big headlines. Not the $50 million contract, not the 25% stake, not the viral video, or the nose-diving stock price. It lives in smaller moments. When a man chose not to leave the seat he had every right to occupy. When a fellow passenger returned, unable to stay silent. When a flight attendant admitted fault in front of a classroom. When a company chooses to halt everything just to become better. When someone with the power to punish instead chose to open a path for redemption. And most of all, when a society finally realizes inequality is not a slogan. It is a choice we must make. Again and again, each day, by ordinary people. You may have never been asked to leave a seat you paid for. Maybe you've never seen someone mistreated. Or if you have, perhaps you thought, it's not my place to get involved. But if this story made you pause, even for 1 second, ask yourself, have I ever stayed silent when I shouldn't have? Then maybe, just maybe, it's already done what it was meant to do. Because justice isn't something we wait for others to deliver. It's something we create in the way we see one another, the way we treat each other, and the courage we summon to stand for what's right, even when no one asks us to.